The November wind cut across the Nebraska prairie like a blade, carrying the promise of an early winter as rancher Ben Tucker rode toward his homestead. After a long day checking cattle, at 48, Ben had weathered enough frontier hardships to recognize the signs of a brutal season ahead, and he was eager to reach the warmth of his cabin before full darkness fell. That's when he saw the small figure huddled against a fence post, near the main road, barely visible in the gathering twilight. Ben reined in his horse and studied the motionless shape, initially thinking it might be an abandoned bundle of clothing. But as he watched, the figure shifted slightly, and Ben realized he was looking at a child, alone on the open prairie as temperature dropped toward freezing. Dismounting quickly, Ben approached the huddled form and found a boy of perhaps 11 years old, thin to the point of being gaunt, wearing clothes that were too small and far too light for the harsh weather. The child's lips were blue with cold, and he was shivering uncontrollably. "Son," Ben said gently, kneeling beside the boy. What are you doing out here?" The boy looked up with eyes that held too much knowledge of hardship for someone so young. His face was smudged with dirt and tears, but his expression showed the stubborn dignity of someone who'd learned not to expect help. "Waiting for the morning stage to Omaha," the boy said, his voice barely audible through chattering teeth. "Conductor said it might stop here if someone flagged it down." Ben looked around at the empty prairie, with no shelter for miles in any direction. "Son, there's no stage stop here. The morning stage runs 20 miles south of here." The boy's face crumpled slightly as this news destroyed whatever plan had brought him to this desolate spot. I didn't know," the man in town said. "What man? What's your name?" "Timothy Walsh." "The man at the feed store said stages sometimes stopped along this road." Timothy's voice grew smaller as he realized he'd been deliberately misdirected. Ben felt anger rising in his chest at the thought of an adult sending a child into the wilderness with false information, but he kept his voice gentle. "Timothy, how long have you been out here?" "Since yesterday morning," Timothy replied. I was trying to get to Omaha to find work." "When did you last eat?" Timothy's answer was so quiet that Ben had to lean closer to hear it. "I haven't eaten in 2 days." The simple truth of those words hit Ben like a physical blow. This child had been sitting by a fence post for over 24 hours, in freezing weather, without food, waiting for help that was never going to come. Without hesitation, Ben took off his heavy wool coat and wrapped it around Timothy's thin shoulders. The coat was far too large for the boy, but it immediately began to provide the warmth his small body desperately needed. "There," Ben said, pulling out his saddlebags. "Let's fix that hunger problem right now." Ben's midday meal had been substantial. Thick slices of bread, cheese, dried beef, and an apple that his housekeeper had packed for him. He'd planned to save half for supper, but looking at Timothy's hollow cheeks and grateful eyes, Ben realized he'd never eaten a meal that mattered less than this one. "Here," Ben said, unwrapping the food and placing it all in Timothy's hands. "Eat slowly at first, or you'll make yourself sick." Timothy stared at the food as if it were treasure, then looked up at Ben with an expression of amazement. "Sir, this is your dinner. I can't take your food." "Son," Ben said firmly but kindly, "when someone hasn't eaten in 2 days, sharing food isn't kindness. It's necessity. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible frontier stories. You won't believe how this simple act of compassion changes both their lives." As Timothy ate with the careful desperation of someone who'd learned not to waste a single crumb, Ben studied the boy more carefully. Despite his obvious poverty and current circumstances, Timothy had good manners, spoke clearly, and carried himself with a dignity that suggested he'd been raised properly. Before whatever circumstances had brought him to this desperate situation, "Timothy," Ben said as the boy ate, "what brings you out here alone? Where's your family?" Timothy paused in his eating, his face shadowing with pain. "Pa died last spring in a farming accident. Ma tried to keep the homestead going, but the bank." His voice broke slightly. "They took everything last month. Ma got sick from the worry and died 2 weeks ago." Ben felt his heart clench at the familiar story. Bank foreclosures had destroyed countless families throughout the territory, leaving widows and orphans with nowhere to go and no resources to rebuild. What about relatives? Anyone who could take you in? Got an uncle in Omaha. Supposedly. Ma talked about him sometimes, said he worked at the stockyards. I was trying to find him. Ben realized that Timothy's plan, while desperate, wasn't entirely unreasonable. Omaha did offer more opportunities than the small farming communities scattered across Nebraska, but the boy's chances of surviving the journey, finding his uncle, and securing help were virtually non-existent. Timothy, Ben said carefully, what if there was another option? What if you didn't have to make that journey to Omaha? Timothy looked up from the food with guarded hope. What do you mean, sir? I mean, I've got a ranch about 5 miles from here. It's not fancy, but it's warm and there's always food on the table. I could use help with the horses and cattle. And you look like a boy who's not afraid of hard work. Timothy stared at Ben, as if he'd spoken in a foreign language. You're offering me a job and a place to stay. I'm offering you a home, Ben corrected, for as long as you need it. Timothy was quiet for a long moment, finishing the last of the bread while he considered this unexpected turn in his fortunes. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of someone far older than his 11 years. Mr. Tucker, why would you do this for a stranger? You don't know anything about me. Ben looked at this remarkable boy who was more concerned with understanding kindness than accepting it, and felt something warm settle in his chest that had nothing to do with gratitude. Son, Ben said honestly, I know everything I need to know. I know you're brave enough to set out on your own to find family. I know you're polite enough to worry about taking my food when you're starving. And I know you're strong enough to survive to days without eating and still have the dignity to ask honest questions. That's enough. That's more than enough, Ben replied firmly. As they prepared to ride back to Ben's ranch, Timothy bundled in the oversized coat and riding double behind the rancher. Both of them understood that something significant had happened. Beside that fence post, Ben had found something he hadn't realized he'd been missing, someone to care for and guide. Timothy had found something he'd thought was lost forever, a place where he was wanted and valued. The simple act of sharing food and warmth was about to transform both their lives in ways neither could have imagined. 3 months had passed since Ben Tucker had found Timothy Walsh by the fence post, and the transformation in both their lives had exceeded anything either had dared to hope. The thin, desperate boy had grown stronger and more confident under Ben's care, while the lonely rancher had discovered that having someone to mentor and protect had given his life a purpose he'd never expected. Timothy had proven to be everything Ben had sensed in those first few minutes: intelligent, hardworking, and possessed of a natural affinity for ranch life. More importantly, the boy had brought something to the isolated homestead that Ben hadn't realized he'd been missing: laughter, conversation, and the simple joy of sharing daily experiences with someone who appreciated them. Mr. Tucker, Timothy called out one crisp February morning as they worked together repairing fence in the south pasture. I've been thinking about something. What's that, son? Ben replied, pleased as always by Timothy's thoughtful questions and observations. That day you found me by the fence post. You gave me your coat and all your food without even knowing my name. Why did you do that? Ben paused in his hammering to consider the question. In 3 months of living together, Timothy had never directly asked about Ben's motivations for helping him. Well, Ben said slowly, I suppose it's because I knew what it felt like to be alone and in need of help. You were an orphan too. Not exactly, Ben replied. But I was 19 when I came west with nothing but the clothes on my back and $50 in my pocket. There were times when I went hungry, times when I slept rough, times when I thought I'd made a terrible mistake leaving everything I knew behind. Timothy listened with the focused attention he always gave to Ben's stories. About his early years on the frontier. Did anyone help you? A few people did, Ben said, his voice taking on the warmth of gratitude that time hadn't diminished. An old rancher named Dutch Henry gave me my first job, even though I didn't know a cow from a horse. A widow named Mrs. Patterson fed me when I was too proud to admit I was hungry. Little kindnesses that probably didn't seem like much to them, but they saved my life. Is that why you helped me? Ben looked at Timothy, seeing in the boy's eager face the same hunger for understanding that had driven his own questions. At that age, Partly, Ben admitted, but mostly I helped you because you needed help, and I was in a position to provide it. Sometimes it's just that simple. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Ben looked up to see 3 riders coming toward them across the pasture, and something about their purposeful approach made him instinctively step closer to Timothy. The lead rider was a well-dressed man in his 30s, accompanied by 2 younger men who had the look of hired hands. As they drew closer, Ben could see that all 3 were well-armed and rode expensive horses. "Are you Ben Tucker?" the lead man called out as he reined in his horse. "I am." Ben replied cautiously. "What can I do for you? My name is Charles Walsh. I'm looking for my nephew, Timothy Walsh." Ben felt his stomach drop as he understood the implications. Charles Walsh, Timothy's uncle from Omaha, the one the boy had been trying to reach when Ben found him. Timothy stepped slightly behind Ben, his face pale with recognition and something that looked like fear. "Uncle Charles," Timothy said quietly. "Timothy," Charles replied, but his tone held none of the warmth one might expect from a relative greeting a long-lost nephew. "I've been looking for you for months. How did you find me?" Timothy asked. "Word gets around when a prominent rancher takes in an orphan boy," Charles replied, his eyes assessing the property around them. "People talk about such things." Ben studied Charles Walsh carefully, noting the calculating look in his eyes, the way his gaze lingered on the well-maintained ranch buildings and healthy cattle. Something about the man's manner set off every instinct Ben had developed in 30 years of evaluating people's character. "Timothy's been well cared for here," Ben said firmly. "He's become part of my family." "I'm sure he has," Charles replied smoothly. "And I'm grateful for your kindness, but Timothy belongs with his blood family now." "I don't want to go with you," Timothy said suddenly, his young voice clear despite the obvious fear behind it. Charles's expression hardened slightly. "Boy, I'm your guardian now. Your mother's dead, which makes me your closest living relative. Subscribe to our channel now." The confrontation that's about to unfold will test everything Ben and Timothy have built together. Ben realized that Timothy was facing the same choice that many frontier children encountered: being claimed by relatives who saw them as property rather than family. The boy's obvious reluctance to go with his uncle suggested that Charles Walsh's motivations might not be entirely pure. "Mr. Walsh," Ben said carefully, "where have you been for the past 3 months? Timothy was alone and desperate when I found him. Why didn't you come looking for him then?" Charles's face reddened slightly at the implied criticism. "I've been busy with business matters. I only recently learned about my sister's death and the boy's situation." "What kind of business?" Ben pressed. "Import and export," Charles replied vaguely. "Very demanding work." Timothy spoke up with the directness that Ben had come to admire. "Uncle Charles, when Pa died, Ma wrote to you asking for help. You never answered her letters." "I never received any letters," Charles said. But his eyes didn't meet Timothy's. Ben realized that they were dealing with a man who had ignored his family's pleas for help but was now interested in claiming Timothy for reasons that had nothing to do with family affection. "Timothy," Ben said gently, "what do you want to do?" Before Timothy could answer, Charles interrupted. "What he wants doesn't matter. I'm his legal guardian, and I'm taking him with me." "Actually," said a new voice from behind them, "that's not entirely accurate." Everyone turned to see Sheriff Morrison riding up, accompanied by a man wearing a federal marshal's badge. "Mr. Walsh," Sheriff Morrison said, dismounting, "this is Federal Marshal Bradley. He's been looking for you for quite some time." Charles Walsh's face went white as he realized he'd walked into a trap. "Charles Walsh," Marshal Bradley announced, "you're under arrest for smuggling, fraud, and conspiracy. We've been tracking your illegal operations for months." As the reality of the situation sank in, Ben understood why Timothy had been so reluctant to go with his uncle. The boy's instincts had been right to fear a man who was involved in criminal activities. "What about Timothy?" Ben asked as the marshals prepared to take Charles into custody. "Well," Sheriff Morrison said with a slight smile, "it seems the boy's legal guardian is going to be unavailable for quite some time. I'd say Timothy needs someone reliable to care for him." Ben looked at Timothy, who was staring up at him with hope and gratitude shining in his young eyes. "Son," Ben said, "how would you feel about making this arrangement permanent? I mean legally permanent." Timothy's answer came without hesitation. "I'd like that more than anything, Mr. Tucker." As Charles Walsh was led away in handcuffs, Ben put his arm around Timothy's shoulders and felt the deep satisfaction of knowing that sometimes doing the right thing led to the right outcome. The boy who had been hungry and alone by a fence post had found not just shelter and food, but a true father. And the rancher who had shared his coat and food with a stranger had discovered that the greatest rewards came from the simplest acts of kindness. 5 years had passed since Ben Tucker had taken off his coat to warm a starving boy, and the transformation in both their lives had created something beautiful on the Nebraska prairie. Timothy Walsh, now legally Timothy Tucker, had grown into a capable 16-year-old who could handle every aspect of ranch work and had earned the respect of every rancher and cowhand in the territory. But more importantly, the bond between Ben and Timothy had deepened into something that transcended their original rescue relationship. They had become father and son in every way that mattered, with a closeness built on mutual respect, shared work, and the kind of love that grew from choosing to care for each other every day. "Pa," Timothy said one morning as they prepared for the spring roundup, "I've been thinking about that day you found me by the fence post." "What about it?" Ben asked, pleased as always when Timothy called him Pa. The title had developed naturally over the years, and Ben treasured it more than any honor he'd ever received. "I've been wondering what would have happened if you'd ridden past that night, if you'd been too tired or too busy to stop." Ben considered the question seriously. "I suppose you would have found another way to survive. You're tougher than you give yourself credit for." "Maybe," Timothy said doubtfully, "but I think more likely I would have frozen to death that night or starved before anyone else came along." "Why are you thinking about this now?" Timothy was quiet for a moment, organizing his thoughts. "Because yesterday I saw something that reminded me of that night." He went on to describe encountering a young girl, maybe 12 years old, begging for food outside the general store in town. Her parents had died in a prairie fire, and she was trying to make her way to relatives in Kansas with no money, no transportation, and no realistic plan for survival. "What did you do?" Ben asked. Though he suspected he already knew, Timothy's answer made Ben's chest swell with pride. "I gave her my lunch money and bought her a hot meal at the cafe. Then I talked to Mrs. Patterson about finding her a place to stay until we could locate her relatives." "Did it work?" "Better than I hoped," Timothy replied with a smile. "Turns out Mrs. Patterson has been looking for someone to help with her grandchildren. Since her daughter moved to California, the girl, Sarah, is going to stay with her and help with the children in exchange for room, board, and schooling." Ben looked at his son, seeing in Timothy's actions the same instinctive generosity that had motivated his own decision to help 5 years earlier. "You know," Ben said thoughtfully, "what you did for Sarah is exactly what I did for you. You saw someone in need and found a way to help." "I learned from watching you," Timothy replied. "You taught me that when you have the power to help someone, you have the responsibility to do it." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a familiar visitor, Sheriff Morrison, who had become a close friend over the years and often stopped by the ranch for coffee and conversation. "Morning, Ben," Timothy, Morrison said, dismounting from his horse with a slight grimace. At 62, the sheriff was feeling the effects of decades of frontier law enforcement. "What brings you out this way, Sheriff?" Ben asked. "Actually, I wanted to talk to Timothy," Morrison replied, his tone more serious than usual. Timothy looked curious. "What about?" Sheriff Morrison studied Timothy carefully before speaking. "Son, you'll be 17 next month, and you've got a reputation throughout this territory as someone with good judgment, courage, and integrity." "Thank you, sir," Timothy replied, uncertain where this was leading. "The territorial government is establishing a new program for young men who show leadership potential," Morrison continued. "It's a training program for future law enforcement officers, territorial administrators, and community leaders. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible frontier stories. You won't believe the amazing opportunity that's about to change Timothy's life." Ben felt his heart swell with pride as Morrison explained the opportunity. Timothy had been selected as one of only 12 young men from across Nebraska Territory to participate in a program that would prepare him for significant responsibilities. In the Territory's future, it would mean spending a year in Lincoln, studying law, administration, and public service, Morrison explained. After that, you'd be qualified for positions ranging from deputy marshal to territorial administrator. Timothy listened with growing excitement, but Ben could also see the conflict in his son's eyes. It sounds like an incredible opportunity, Timothy said carefully. But what about the ranch? Pa needs my help, especially during roundup season. Ben realized that Timothy was facing the kind of choice that defined a young man's future, whether to pursue opportunities for advancement or to stay and fulfill existing responsibilities. Timothy, Ben said firmly, this is exactly the kind of opportunity your mother would have wanted for you, and it's exactly what I want for you too. But the ranch will be here when you get back, Ben finished. Son, I've been ranching for 30 years. I can handle one season without you, especially knowing that you're preparing for something important. Timothy looked between Ben and Sheriff Morrison, clearly torn between loyalty and ambition. Can I think about it? Timothy asked. Of course, Morrison replied, but I'll need an answer within a week. That evening, as Ben and Timothy sat on the porch watching the sunset, they discussed the opportunity and its implications for their future together. Pa, Timothy said, are you sure you don't mind? I know how much work the ranch is. Ben looked at his son, seeing in Timothy's concerned face the same caring nature that had impressed him 5 years earlier. Timothy, Ben said, do you remember what I told you about Dutch Henry, the rancher who gave me my first job? Yes, sir. The greatest gift he gave me wasn't the job or the wages. It was the belief that I could become something more than I was. That's what parents do for their children. They prepare them to fly. Timothy was quiet for a long moment. What if I go to Lincoln and discover I'm not cut out for law enforcement or administration? Then you'll come home and we'll figure out what you are cut out for, Ben replied. But Timothy, I've watched you for 5 years. You're a natural leader. You care about justice. And you have the kind of character that makes people trust you. I think you'll do extraordinarily well. 1 year later, Ben Tucker stood in the Territorial Capitol building in Lincoln, watching with enormous pride as his son graduated at the top of his class. From the Territorial Leadership Program, Timothy had excelled in every area of study and had been offered positions with both the Territorial Marshal Service and the Territorial Attorney General's office. But the moment that meant the most to Ben came after the ceremony, when Timothy approached him with a decision that surprised everyone. Pa, Timothy said, I've decided to turn down both job offers. Ben felt a moment of confusion. Why? These are incredible opportunities. Timothy smiled at his father's concern. Because I've realized what I really want to do with my life. I want to come home and help you expand the ranch. But more than that, I want to establish a program for helping orphaned and abandoned children throughout the territory. The idea was brilliant in its simplicity. Timothy proposed using the ranch as a base for a network that would identify children in need, place them with suitable families, and provide education and training to prepare them for successful adult lives. It would be like what you did for me, Timothy explained, but organized and expanded to help hundreds of children instead of just one. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories of kindness, family, and paying it forward from the American frontier. Hit that subscribe button now, because these tales prove that one act of compassion can change countless lives. 10 years later, the Tucker Ranch had become the center of the most successful child welfare program in the American West. Timothy Tucker, now a respected leader in territorial affairs, had placed over 300 orphan children in loving homes and had established schools and training programs that were serving as models for other territories. But on quiet evenings when father and son sat on their porch watching the sunset, Ben would sometimes remember that cold November night when he'd found a starving boy by a fence post. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't stopped that night? Ben asked one such evening. Timothy, now 26 and married to Sarah Patterson, the girl he'd helped years earlier, smiled at his father's familiar question. "I don't wonder about that anymore." Timothy replied, "I know exactly what would have happened. You would have turned around and come back, because that's the kind of man you are. You don't ride past people who need help." Ben looked at his son, at the thriving ranch around them, and at the children playing in the yard who were part of their extended family of rescued kids, and realized that Timothy was right. "I haven't eaten in 2 days," Timothy had said that night. So Ben had taken off his coat and shared his food, never imagining that those simple acts of kindness would grow into a legacy that would change hundreds of lives and create a family bound, not by blood, but by the conscious choice to care for each other. Your subscription helps us continue bringing these incredible tales of frontier kindness and chosen family to life. Subscribe now and join us for more amazing stories that prove the smallest acts of compassion can create the biggest changes in the world.